I met Nick Moore, who's the Education Policy Advisor for Alabama Governor Ivey. And he runs the Governor Ivey's Office of Education and Workforce Transformation Policy Advisor. I met Nick at a National Governors Association meeting, and he's going to be talking about transformation that spans across education and the workforce, a really important topic for governors and policymakers today. Nick's going to lift up the visionary work being planned and implemented in the state of Alabama on creating a continuous learning system aligned and competency-based. Nick, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, ma'am. It's a pleasure, and it is my honor to represent Governor Ivey at the Aurora Institute's national convening. And I'm here to share with you a little bit about Governor Ivey's what we call P20W. We're now even calling a B20W plan for connecting education to the economy. And this is a strategy that imbues an equity imperative to try to make sure that we're breaking down the barriers entering education and the workforce that are faced by the 820,000 Alabamians that have been displaced by COVID-19, and then the 41% of Alabamians that are not currently participating in the workforce because they face a barrier to entering education and workforce training. Next slide, please. So the governor is committed to reaching, as I said, an attainment goal of 500,000 credential workers by 2025. And the way that she went about doing this was creating our state's combined 2020 WIOA plan into a vision document rather than a compliance document, and put together a two-prong career pathway model that connects work-based learning, a currency of credentials, and dual enrollment to allow youth to have a compressed pipeline to entering into the workforce more quickly so they can complete industry recognized credentials and an apprenticeship, and then also an associate degree potentially at the time of graduation. And for adults to have a more elongated pathway with multiple points of entry and exit, knowing that adults often need to have a modularized degree to where they can earn a credential, a couple of courses, and then have that articulate back to a traditional 2 or 4 year degree. Next slide, please. This is our logic model for our state's 2020 WIOA plan. I won't belabor this long, but the notion is that we're connecting education to the workforce and the economy through a reciprocal feedback loop, allowing business and industry to lead that effort by first identifying what is the labor market situation in the state and in each of our state's regions, and then ensuring that we are figuring out what are the in-demand jobs, the opportunity occupations that can often be the entry-level occupation into a long-term career pathway that leads to self-sufficiency. Next slide, please. So one thing that Governor Ivey wanted to make sure we did was working with our legislature. We recognize that it's real easy to say we're going to come up with a mastery or competency-based system for education in the workforce. It's much harder to actually do that unless you develop a new infrastructure for connecting credentials and competencies. And so Act 2019-506 was passed into law nearly 2 years ago, and it created something called the ACCCP. It's essentially a third-party quality assurance body that's composed of 16 sector strategies that we call technical advisory committees, and they have a twofold job. The first job is to identify our in-demand jobs, and then second is to identify and develop competency models and pathways and the credentials of value that are linked to those occupations. So I'm going to tell you how they go about that work now. Next slide, please. So we have a 5-star rubric, and I'm sorry that the image there is not as clear as I would have liked to have been, but we have a 5-star rubric for determining our in-demand occupations. And we're looking at labor market information. We're looking to make sure that the occupations provide a family sustaining wage. There's growth over the year and the decade, and that also it's above the poverty threshold. And so the 4th and 5th criteria is that it's either above the poverty threshold or requires a credential of value. The reason why we make that distinguished, or we did make that difference, is because we want to make sure that we're not promoting jobs that would not allow someone to reach a family sustaining wage. And so if a job is along a career pathway, then they can advance into the next job along a sequence and earn stackable credentials, that's fine. But if it's a job that would just sort of dead end at a wage that would be below the poverty threshold, that's certainly not one that would be on our in-demand list. So stackability, transferability, and portability of skills along a pathway is imperative. And so the occupations that are on at least 3 of our in-demand regional lists are then put on the state list. Next slide, please. So some of y'all may have seen the competency models that the Urban Institute has developed along with the Department of Labor, ETA. We extended the scope of our tax by commissioning a survey of employer competencies, and this was our first year of doing this. And we use that information from all of our employers in the state, and we got a pretty good representative sampling to develop competency models. And if each one of these tiers was live, it would be filled and populated with many different competencies. But the idea here is that we tied the first 4 tiers together to make a customized job readiness credential that also meets the definition of a recognized post-secondary credential from WIOA, because we made it no longer just a job readiness credential, but we made it have industry and sector specific skills. That was a sort of a weakness of the WIOA system that we wanted to try to figure out a way to allow the state to make it a license recognized by the state, so we could then offer that and make it WIOA eligible, and certainly what employers wanted. But the next step after the models were developed is that between August and September, we developed career pathways that connected them together. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what our 2-prong career pathway model looks like. I described it before, but we're combining secondary CTE, post-secondary CTE, WIOA Title I and Title IV to develop the youth prong that allows, as I said, youth to get a more compressed pathway into the workforce if they'd like. And then on the adult side, combining adult basic education, post-secondary CTE, and the WIOA titles to give them multiple points of entry and exit along the pathway to their destination occupation. Next slide, please. And so I'll just, you can look at this on your own as later on, but here's our 10 non-degree credential quality assurance criteria. And so we want to make sure that as we are reviewing each credential that's associated and denotes mastery of one of our credentials of value, that it has at least a 20% wage premium, it's traceable and trackable by our longitudinal data system, and that it's aligned to an in-demand occupation. So we're making sure that we're not recognizing or creating credentials in thin air just among education and training providers. It's important for credentials to be developed by employers and then to be validated and for programs to be developed by education and training bodies. Next slide, please. So we are developing a credential registry that will house all of our registered credentials, and that's going to allow us to operationalize a credential currency. And that credential currency is going to then allow us to develop a skills-based hiring ecosystem. Next slide, please. And so what the skills-based hiring ecosystem is going to allow us to do is offer more asynchronous short-term reskilling and upskilling programs in the 5 industries that are actually most resilient, so that we can use our Reimagining Workforce Prep grant that we got, that was one of the discretionary grants for the CARES Act, to reskill and upskill the 800,000 plus folks that have been displaced into one of the jobs that was actually open in February in the state and is still open now, except in February, these 800,000 folks were not thinking about re-entering post-secondary education. Next slide, please. And so this is just an example of what our Atlas system, our state longitudinal data system, looks like. And we'll move past this so we can just close out here. And last thing I'll leave you with is we're developing a learning and employment record that takes this new foundation of skills and competencies and gives this occupational ontology back to a triad of stakeholders, employers, individual job seekers and students, and education and training providers, so that employers are using our competency models and pathways to make skills-based job descriptions, posting that, and then being able to geo-fence the candidate pool that has the right mix of skills on their learning and employment record, and then also allows our education and training providers to align programs to the actual labor market information, so there's not an anecdotal process involved in that. So I will turn that back over to you, Ms. Patrick, and well, I'll mention David. So David is our self-sufficiency tool that we developed with Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I know I'm out of time, but I'll just note that we are very intentional about connecting human services and workforce services. And we recognize that as we're developing competency-based pathways, if people need to have a bridge to self-sufficiency, that in many ways people face short-term hurdles such as the loss of child care subsidies, SNAP and TANF benefits, and we need to use our public workforce system as a bridge and a transition point to allow them to persist in the labor force. So thanks so much, and certainly would be happy to follow up with anyone that would like to chat about any of these initiatives.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I know we could spend an entire hour on each of these snapshots. I'm so grateful for your being here. There are just a few key takeaways before we're heading to a quick break on Zoom, which is that notion of using these opportunities to create a vision instead of just being compliance. Like take your WIOA plan, your Perkins CTE plan, and create a vision across the state, not just like, how do we comply? The fact that Alabama had the vision too, to understand that we really have to get to quality credentials and meaningful credentials. And that might take, we don't have really good quality agencies, and the fact that your legislation set up this sort of independent quality credential function is something that we do see in other countries like New Zealand that we don't yet have here. And I think you're really setting a bar and also just leading in this way. And the two other areas on one of your last slides was this idea of an integrated learner record or a comprehensive learner record that spans education and employment is critical, as well as the ability to develop capacity for prior learning assessment. So we can actually credential or micro-credential when students are learning inside and outside of school in work-based learning and beyond. So Nick, thank you so much. And thanks to our presenters this morning.